02:47 a.m., January 28, 1945. More than 200 meters beneath the Owl Mountains, a German engineering officer stood motionless under a row of weak yellow bulbs. The light barely reached the concrete floor beneath his boots. It faded into darkness long before it touched the ceiling. The air around him was cold, in a way that did not change with the seasons, steady buried, trapped. 8, maybe 10 degrees Celsius. The temperature of a place that never knew daylight. In his gloved hand was a single sheet of paper. It had arrived less than an hour earlier, carried down through the tunnel system by a runner who did not ask questions. The message was brief. There were no explanations, no signatures that mattered anymore. Only an order from Berlin transmitted through collapsing lines of command that were already losing meaning. Abandon all sites immediately. Destroy what can be destroyed. Leave the rest. The officer read it twice, then a third time slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. Around him stretched the unfinished heart of the project he had overseen for more than a year. Kilometers of tunnels, caverns carved directly into granite, reinforced concrete walls poured thicker than anything required for storage or shelter, everything halted mid-motion, as if the mountain itself had been frozen halfway through, becoming something else. He did not speak. There was no one to speak to. This was the moment the mountain went silent. The tunnels breathed softly around him. Water dripped from hairline cracks in the ceiling, striking the concrete floor with a slow, hollow rhythm. Each drop echoed, multiplied, then faded into a distance that could not be measured by sight. The smell was constant and unavoidable: damp cement, rusting steel, stagnant water, pooled in shallow depressions along the corridor edges. It was the smell of a place designed to endure pressure, isolation, and time. The lights flickered once, then steadied. They were never meant to be permanent. Temporary illumination for a project that was supposed to move faster than the war itself. Now they cast long, uneven shadows across walls that had never been used, rooms that had never been entered for their intended purpose. The officer took a few slow steps forward. His boots scraped faintly against grit and concrete dust. The sound traveled far, rebounded, returned, altered. In these tunnels, every noise came back changed, as if the mountain remembered it differently. To his left, a side chamber opened into darkness. The ceiling rose far above the reach of the lamps, supported by thick concrete ribs poured with precision. The space was too large for simple storage, too carefully reinforced for anything temporary. Electrical conduits ran along the walls, some ending abruptly, where installation had stopped. Heavy anchor points protruded from the ceiling unused, waiting for machines that would never arrive. He knew the figures by heart. Tens of kilometers of tunnels, thousands of tons of concrete, thousands of men who had worked here without choice, without protection, without the expectation of survival. Many of them would never leave the mountain at all. The order in his hand made no mention of them. Some sections could be destroyed. Charges had already been placed in key access tunnels set to collapse entrances and bury corridors. But much of the complex was too vast, too deep, too solid to erase completely. Granite did not yield easily, even to explosives. Concrete, this thick, resisted urgency. The mountain would keep what it had been given. He folded the paper once, carefully, and slipped it into his coat pocket. The decision had already been made far above his rank. His role now was not to question purpose, only to obey timing. Somewhere deeper in the complex, engines shut down one by one. The low hum of power faded. Pumps stopped. The faint vibration that had once traveled through the walls disappeared. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. It pressed inward, filling every corridor, every chamber, every unfinished room. The officer stood still as the last echoes died. This place would never be completed. But it would not truly be destroyed either. It would remain here, sealed in darkness, holding its shape, holding its secrets, waiting long after the war above it reached its end. To understand what was abandoned that night, one must move past the entrance tunnels and continue inward, far beyond where daylight could ever reach. The further the passages extend, the more ordinary language begins to fail. These are not narrow shafts cut for hiding or escape. They are vast corridors, wide enough for vehicles to pass side by side, tall enough that the ceiling disappears into shadow when the lamps are held at shoulder height. Some hallways stretch so long and straight that they resemble underground rail platforms. The air within them barely moves. Sound does not behave as it should. A single footstep can echo for several seconds, returning softened, distorted as if the mountain itself were absorbing it. Water gathers along the edges of the floors in thin, reflective sheets, undisturbed for decades. In places, concrete pours were halted mid-process, leaving frozen waves of hardened cement spilling across the ground like time arrested halfway through motion. The ceilings are the first detail that unsettles visitors. They are too high. In many chambers, they rise several stories above the floor, supported by massive concrete ribs and columns that were calculated to bear extraordinary loads. No ordinary storage facility requires this kind of vertical space. No conventional factory demands walls reinforced to this extent. The proportions feel wrong, oversized, overbuilt, excessive. Everywhere there is evidence of scale without context. Rooms large enough to hold aircraft sit empty and unfinished. Corridors branch and rejoin in patterns that suggest careful planning rather than improvisation. This is not a maze created by accident. It is an architecture that assumes permanence. Beneath the Owl Mountains lies a network of tunnels measuring tens of kilometers in total length, spread across at least 7 major complexes. Each complex was carved separately into solid granite, then connected through planned passageways. Some sections descend only 50 meters below the surface. Others plunge far deeper, more than 200 meters into the mountain's core, where pressure isolation and darkness become absolute. The rock itself tells part of the story. Granite is not forgiving. It does not yield easily to drills or explosives. Cutting through it requires time, precision, and immense energy. Yet these tunnels were not merely cut, they were shaped. Walls were smoothed, floors leveled. Reinforced concrete was poured in layers 2 to 4 meters thick, forming shells capable of withstanding direct aerial bombardment. Steel rebar runs through the concrete like bones binding the structure into something closer to a bunker city than a construction site. This level of engineering demands resources that were already scarce by the final years of the war. Steel, cement, machinery, transport capacity, skilled oversight, all of it was diverted here, away from cities being bombed away from fronts collapsing across Europe. At a time when Germany was losing factories above ground, an immense industrial effort continued underground, hidden from the sky, and that is the question the tunnels themselves seem to ask. This place is too large to be a simple shelter, too reinforced to be a temporary headquarters, too complex to exist without a long-term purpose. Warehouses do not require ceilings this high. Factories do not need walls this thick unless what they protect is more important than the workers inside. The deeper one goes, the harder it becomes to believe that this was meant to be abandoned. Everything about the construction suggests urgency paired with expectation, an assumption that once completed this underground world would be used, occupied, powered, defended. The geometry of the spaces implies planning years into the future, not months. The infrastructure was designed to endure pressure from above and time itself. Yet no signs remain of what was meant to fill these spaces. No machines were ever installed, no production lines completed, no command rooms fully equipped. The mountain holds the shape of intention, but not its fulfillment. Why would the Nazi state commit such enormous resources to a place no one was meant to see? Why build a fortress beneath the earth at the moment when the war above was already slipping beyond control? The tunnels do not answer. They only remain vast, silent, and waiting, an unfinished giant sleeping beneath the mountains. The mountain did not build itself. Every meter carved into granite began with a human body, forced into motion. The men who dug these tunnels came from the nearby Gross Rosen concentration camp and its satellite labor camps scattered across Lower Silesia. They arrived already weakened by hunger, by cold, by disease, by months or years of abuse, and were driven underground to work shifts that stretched from 12 to 16 hours a day. They worked with what the mountain allowed. Pneumatic drills were scarce. Much of the excavation was done by hand with picks and hammers striking granite that resisted every blow. The air deep underground was heavy and wet. Ventilation lagged behind excavation. Dust filled the lungs. Water seeped constantly through the rock, soaking clothing that never fully dried. In winter, the cold penetrated bone. In summer, the tunnels trapped heat and moisture, turning breath into labor. Food was never enough. Rations were calculated not for survival, but for endurance measured in weeks rather than years. Weight fell from bodies rapidly. Illness spread quickly in confined spaces. Tuberculosis, dysentery infections that went untreated. Those who collapsed were dragged aside. Those who could not stand again were removed from the tunnels and rarely seen afterward. Supervision was relentless. Guards enforced pace with rifles and dogs. Delays were punished. Sabotage, real or imagined, was answered with beatings or execution. There was no margin for error, no allowance for exhaustion. The mountain demanded progress, and progress was measured in meters cut, not lives spent. The work did not stop when men died. Cave-ins were common. Granite fractured unpredictably. Support beams failed under weight they had not yet been designed to bear. When a tunnel collapsed, the priority was not rescue. Clearing debris slowed construction. The living were ordered to work around the dead, to seal blocked passages, to pour concrete over sections that had become unstable. In many cases, bodies remained where they fell, entombed behind fresh walls of reinforced cement. By conservative estimates, more than 20,000 forced laborers died during the construction of Project Riese. The exact number will never be known. Records were incomplete, deliberately obscured or destroyed. Some men died from exhaustion, others from disease. Many were executed for falling behind. Others simply disappeared into the mountain, their deaths unrecorded, their names never marked. For them, the tunnels were not architecture. They were confinement. Walk through the complex today, and the evidence remains quiet, but undeniable. Tool marks still score the granite walls, irregular, uneven, cut by hands that lacked strength and time. Some passages narrow, abruptly ending in blunt, unfinished faces of rock, where excavations stopped the moment the order came to abandon the site. These dead ends were never meant to exist. They were meant to continue to connect, to open into something else. Instead, they stand as frozen moments of interrupted labor. In certain sections, the floor slopes downward into darkness, then vanishes beneath collapsed debris. Concrete seals block entire corridors poured hastily without markings. No maps explain what lies beyond. No documentation survives to say how many men were lost behind those walls. The mountain keeps its count. There are places where the geometry changes, suddenly tight turns, lowered ceilings, awkward transitions where haste overtook planning. These are the scars of urgency moments, when deadlines mattered more than safety. In some chambers, rough symbols are scratched into the walls, lines, numbers, shapes, whose meanings were never recorded. They are not decorations. They are marks, left by people who needed to prove they had existed even briefly, in a place designed to erase them. The deeper one goes, the more the tunnels feel less like construction and more like burial. Silence settles differently here. It presses inward. It carries weight. This is the point where the story changes. Project Riese cannot be understood as a mystery of engineering alone. Its unanswered questions, the purpose, the design, the secrecy, mean little without acknowledging the cost paid to ask them. These tunnels are not empty. They are filled with absence, with lives cut short and sealed away beneath layers of stone and concrete. It is tempting to focus on scale, on ambition, on the audacity of carving a fortress beneath a mountain. But the truth lies closer to the ground, closer to the walls, scored by exhausted hands. This place was built by people who were never meant to leave it alive. No memorial marks where they fell. No graves record their names. The mountain became their record. When the work stopped on that January night in 1945, the order to abandon the project did not distinguish between structure and sacrifice. Machinery was shut down. Entrances were sealed. What could not be destroyed was left behind. That included the dead. Project Riese stands today not only as an unfinished construction, but as a mass grave spread across kilometers of stone. A place where history did not simply pass, but settled, heavy, silent, and unresolved. And once that truth is seen, it becomes impossible to walk these tunnels as neutral ground. If Project Riese were only a failed construction project, its story would end with abandonment. Unfinished work is common in war, but the deeper investigators move into the tunnels, the more the physical evidence resists simple explanations. Certain details do not fit the logic of warehouses, factories, or shelters. They linger as questions carved directly into stone and concrete. The first sign appears in the layout itself. The tunnels are not arranged randomly, nor do they follow the purely functional geometry of industrial mining. In several sections, corridors mirror one another with near-perfect symmetry, branching at measured angles that feel deliberate rather than convenient. Some chambers are circular, their walls curving smoothly instead of following the straight lines typical of storage halls. Others form octagonal spaces carefully proportioned with reinforced columns placed at equal intervals. This kind of geometry serves no obvious industrial purpose. Factories prioritize efficiency of movement. Warehouses maximize rectangular space. Circular and multi-sided rooms complicate construction and waste material, yet here they exist underground, carved into granite, then reinforced with thick concrete as if shape itself mattered. The symmetry suggests planning beyond improvisation, an architectural intent that goes unanswered. The second clue lies embedded in the walls. Throughout the complex, heavy electrical infrastructure appears far in excess of what would be required for lighting or basic machinery. Thick cables run through channels cut into the concrete, some terminating in reinforced alcoves, clearly designed to house large electrical components. In several areas, pits and mounting frames indicate the planned installation of transformers capable of handling high-voltage loads. These systems were never completed, but their scale is unmistakable. This was not a modest power grid meant to support tools and lamps. The infrastructure suggests an energy demand comparable to major industrial or command facilities. Generating, transforming, and distributing power at this level underground would have required a clear purpose and careful coordination above ground to supply it. No records explain what systems were meant to be powered here. No machinery remains to justify the capacity. The cables simply end, cut short by the war's end, leaving behind a question rather than an answer. Then there are the markings. Unlike modern graffiti, the marks on the walls of Project Riese are restrained, repetitive, and functional. In several corridors, sets of vertical lines are etched into the concrete or scratched into exposed stone counting marks, arranged in deliberate sequences. Some appear to mark days. Others stop abruptly, mid-series never completed. Nearby simple symbols recur: arrows, circles, intersecting lines, scratched by hand rather than applied with tools. There are no slogans, no names, no declarations of ideology. These are not messages meant for an audience. They are records left by people who expected no witnesses. In places, the marks cluster near sealed passages or unfinished rooms, as if someone was tracking time spent in a specific location or waiting for something that never arrived. What they counted, days' shifts or delays, remains unknown. The most unsettling clues, however, are the barriers. Across the Project Riese complex, entire sections are blocked by thick concrete walls poured after excavation had already progressed beyond them. Some corridors end in sudden clean seals, their surfaces smoother and more finished than the surrounding walls. Others are partially collapsed either by deliberate demolition or controlled cave-ins. In several cases, maps of the complex simply stop where access stops. A number of these sealed areas remain closed to the public today. Some are deemed structurally unsafe. Others are restricted without detailed explanation. Even modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar suggest that additional chambers exist beyond the visible limits, spaces that were carved, reinforced, and then intentionally hidden. Someone made a decision about what should remain accessible and what should disappear. Individually, each of these elements might be dismissed. Unusual architecture can result from changing plans. Overbuilt electrical systems may reflect contingency thinking. Wall markings can be the byproduct of human confinement. Sealed tunnels are common in abandoned mines, but taken together the pattern becomes harder to ignore. The geometry suggests purpose beyond storage. The electrical infrastructure implies power demands never fulfilled. The markings record time without explanation. The sealed areas point to deliberate concealment rather than simple abandonment. All of it exists beneath a mountain, out of sight, built at enormous cost, during a period when resources were vanishing everywhere else. No single clue proves intent, but together they form a shape, an outline of something planned, something interrupted, something that someone decided should not be fully revealed. Standing in these tunnels, surrounded by silence and stone, the feeling becomes unavoidable. This place does not merely hide answers, it feels as though it was designed to. At this point, the story reaches a necessary boundary. Despite decades of research exploration and documentation, no definitive conclusion exists about the intended purpose of Project Riese. No surviving order spells it out, no blueprint labels its final function, no post-war testimony provides a complete explanation. What remains are fragments, physical evidence, without a key structures, without instructions, ambition without closure. This absence is not accidental. In the final months of the war, German command structures collapsed unevenly, documents were destroyed deliberately, records were moved, burned, or buried. Entire chains of authority disappeared before surrender was formalized. What survives of Project Riese is therefore not a finished answer, but a debate grounded in what can be seen, measured, and inferred. Historians agree on one thing. This was not an ordinary construction project. Beyond that, interpretation begins. One hypothesis suggests that Project Riese was intended as an underground command headquarters, a place from which senior leadership could continue to operate after surface cities became untenable. The scale supports the idea, the depth. The reinforced ceilings, the redundant access routes, all align with defensive planning. Some chambers appear suited for coordination rather than production. The location removed from major population centers yet connected to rail networks would have allowed controlled movement without visibility. Others argue that the complex was meant to become a final stage command and control center during the last phase of the war, a fallback position designed to survive sustained bombing while directing remaining forces. In this interpretation, the electrical infrastructure would support communications equipment, mapping rooms, and operational coordination. The unfinished state reflects not a change of purpose, but a shortage of room. A third hypothesis frames Project Riese as an underground industrial site intended to house weapons production beyond the reach of Allied air power. By 1944, above-ground factories were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Moving production underground was already established practice elsewhere. The question here is not whether weapons were meant to be produced underground, but why this facility was built on such a scale, with such unusual geometry, and with no clear evidence of assembly lines ever being installed. Some researchers point instead toward the possibility of secure storage, not production, not command, but preservation. A place to hide materials, documents, or assets deemed too valuable to lose. The sealed sections, the deliberate blocking of corridors, and the lack of installed machinery support this interpretation as much as they challenge it. If something was meant to be stored here temporarily, the absence of evidence may be the point. Each hypothesis addresses part of the structure. None accounts for all of it. The difficulty lies not in imagination, but in restraint. Project Riese attracts speculation precisely because it resists explanation. But speculation becomes distortion when it ignores the limits of evidence. There is no proof that this was a superweapon laboratory. No documentation ties it to experimental technology. No credible source supports claims beyond conventional wartime logic. The mystery here is not fantastical. It is administrative, strategic, and human. And that may be the most unsettling possibility. What if Project Riese was not one thing at all? What if its purpose changed mid-construction, shaped by desperation rather than design? What if competing visions overlapped command, production, storage without any single one ever being realized? In a collapsing state, clarity is often the first casualty, so the questions remain deliberately narrow, If this was a factory, why were the spaces shaped this way? If it was a headquarters, why was it never equipped? If it was storage, what required such depth and secrecy? And if it was none of these, then what justified burying so many lives beneath a mountain for something that never came to exist? The shift from history to mystery does not mean abandoning evidence. It means accepting its limits. Project Riese stands as a structure defined as much by what is missing as by what remains. The tunnels do not tell a story outright. They invite interpretation and then resist it. We do not know what was meant to happen here. We only know that something important enough to demand secrecy, scale, and sacrifice was planned, and that whatever it was, the mountain kept it from ever being completed. That unanswered tension is not a failure of history. It is the reason this story refuses to end. Today, Project Riese exists in fragments. Some sections have been stabilized and opened to visitors. Guided paths lead through reinforced corridors where lighting has been restored and water diverted. Footsteps echo where once only forced labor moved in silence. Information plaques explain dates, dimensions, and names of nearby camps. For a few hours at a time, the mountain allows people to enter and leave. But most of the complex remains beyond reach. Entire tunnels lie flooded water, rising steadily from underground springs that were never fully controlled. Other passages have collapsed under their own weight, the granite reclaiming spaces that were never meant to be abandoned. In several areas, access is restricted, outright sealed behind gates, concrete walls, or administrative decisions that offer no detailed explanation. Engineers cite instability. Authorities cite safety. Maps stop where certainty ends. Modern surveys suggest that more chambers still exist, beyond what is visible, voids carved and reinforced, then hidden. Some may be intact. Others may hold nothing at all. No one can say with confidence. The mountain does not confirm or deny. This incomplete accessibility shapes the legacy of Project Riese. It is not a ruin that has been fully claimed by time, nor a monument neatly preserved. It sits in between, part museum, part tomb, part question mark. Each open corridor makes the closed ones feel more deliberate. And that is where the story settles. War leaves behind objects that can be cataloged, wreckage, documents, ruins, but it also leaves behind spaces that resist explanation. Places built in urgency, abandoned in silence, and left standing because no one is certain what should be done with them. Project Riese is one of those places. It represents ambition without outcome, planning without resolution, sacrifice without acknowledgement. Thousands of lives were consumed to shape these tunnels, yet no definitive purpose ever emerged from them. The mountain holds that contradiction intact. There are things here no one is eager to dismantle, and no one prepared to fully interpret. To destroy it would feel like erasing evidence. To explain it completely would require certainty that does not exist, so it remains sealed in parts, exposed in others, hovering between memory and omission. The war that created Project Riese ended long ago. The regime that ordered it collapsed. The people who built it died without recognition. But the structure itself persists, resisting final definition. Project Riese was never completed, but it was never truly finished either. It remains beneath the mountains, quiet and unresolved, holding the weight of decisions made in darkness and never clarified in daylight. A reminder that history does not always conclude, sometimes it simply stops speaking. And if you want to continue opening the doors that were sealed in 1945 to explore the place's history left unfinished, leave a comment, share what stood out to you, and stay with us for the next story still waiting beneath the surface.